He called me a boiler jockey. That boiler was a 1,400-degree bomb I'd kept from exploding for 35 years by listening to it breathe. The kid who fired me couldn't tell you what black liquor smells like when it's running too rich. Couldn't tell you why the floor plates near the smelt spouts run hotter on the east side after 2 a.m. Couldn't tell you that a recovery boiler doesn't warn you with alarms. It warns you with a sound you can only hear if you've stood next to it for 3 decades. Chase Lennox had a Wharton MBA and 14 months at a packaging startup in Charlotte. His aunt was Patricia Lennox, CEO of Southern Loblolly Paper, a $2.3 billion operation. He'd been at the mill for 9 weeks when he sat across from me in the conference room on the second floor of the admin building, the one with the window that looked directly out at the recovery boiler stack, and told me the company was moving in a new direction. September 11th. A Wednesday, 7:14 a.m. I know because my shift had ended at 6, and I'd stayed to check the feed-water ratio before the day crew took over. I was still wearing my steel toes, still had soot under my fingernails. Chase was wearing a quarter-zip pullover and white sneakers that had never touched a mill floor. He had a folder open, didn't look at it. We're implementing a Honeywell DCS monitoring suite across all critical process units, he said. Full digital integration. The boards approved a $4.2 million modernization package. Part of that transition means restructuring the superintendent role. He paused like he expected me to ask a question. Grantham, your institutional knowledge is appreciated, but we can't build a modern safety culture around one person's intuition. We need systems. Repeatable, auditable systems. He said, intuition, the way you'd say superstition. You're being offered a separation package, 12 weeks salary, continuation of benefits through December. I think you'll find it's generous. I looked at him. Then I looked past him, out the window at the stack. The plume was running clean. Light gray, almost white, good combustion. I'd tuned the air-to-fuel ratio myself at 4:30 that morning. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, picked up my hard hat from the table. When do you need the badge? He blinked. I think he'd prepared for an argument. End of the week is fine. I nodded once, walked out. I didn't argue because there was nothing to argue about. Not with him, not in that room. What I knew about that boiler couldn't be transferred in a meeting or captured in a monitoring suite, and what I owned underneath it, well, Chase Lennox hadn't read the lease. I started at Southern Loblolly the summer I turned 1989. My grandfather, Earl Ives, had sold the mill its riverfront parcel in 1952, 40 acres of bottomland along the Black Warrior River. Sold isn't the right word. He leased it. 99 years. The recovery boiler sits on that ground. The chemical storage tanks sit on that ground. The wastewater treatment lagoons sit on that ground. The lease had a covenant. Section 4, Paragraph 2, required Ives family approval for any material change in safety operations on the leased parcel. My grandfather insisted on it. He'd lost a cousin in a boiler explosion at a mill in Bogalusa, Louisiana, in 1947. He said if his land was going to hold something that could kill people, his family would have a say in how it was run. When Earl died in 1981, the lease transferred to my father, Curtis. When Curtis died in 2003, it transferred to me. I'd been working at the mill for 14 years by then. Nobody in administration thought twice about it. The lease was filed with the Tuscaloosa County Probate Court. The annual payments, $47,000 adjusted for CPI every 10 years, came to me like clockwork. It was just paperwork to them. It wasn't paperwork to me. I came up through every station in that mill: pulp washer operator, lime kiln attendant, evaporator technician. I spent 3 years on the causticizing line before I ever set foot near the recovery boiler. When I finally qualified as a recovery boiler operator in 1996, the superintendent at the time was a man named Dutch Morrison, 61 years old, hands like catcher's mitts. Dutch had run that boiler for 22 years, and the first thing he told me was this: the instruments will tell you what happened. Your body will tell you what's about to happen. He wasn't being poetic. A recovery boiler processes black liquor, the waste chemical soup from the pulping process, at temperatures between 1,400 and 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The liquor sprays into the furnace through oscillating guns. If the spray pattern shifts wrong, if the smelt bed builds unevenly, if water contacts molten smelt, the explosion can level a building. It has. 14 men died at a mill in Wisconsin in 2017 because nobody caught a tube leak in time. 6 died in Georgia in 2001, 4 in Quebec in 1999. I'm telling you this because what happened next still wakes me up some mornings. Not with anger, with something quieter than that. Stay with me. I need to tell this right. Dutch taught me to feel the temperature gradient through my boots. The steel floor plates near the smelt spouts conduct heat differently depending on bed distribution. Left side running hot means the char bed is migrating. Right side cooling means the spray guns need recalibrating. There's a low frequency vibration, maybe 18 hertz below what most people consciously hear, that the boiler produces when the combustion air balance shifts. Dutch called it the hum. I learned to hear it the way a mother hears her kid in a crowded room. It wasn't on any readout. No sensor measured it. Was it lived in the steel and in the air, and in 35 years of standing on that floor at 4 a.m. when the world was quiet enough to listen. By 2002, I was superintendent. Dutch retired. I ran the recovery boiler through 3 capacity upgrades, 2 EPA compliance overhauls, and the installation of the Honeywell distributed control system that Chase Lennox thought could replace me. I helped design the alarm parameters for that system. I knew its blind spots better than the engineers who built it. 35 years. I never lost a man. Never had a reportable smelt water incident. The insurance underwriters at Hartford Steam Boiler cited our mill specifically in their 2019 risk assessment as having the lowest recovery boiler incident rate in the southeastern United States. They cited me by name. Chase Lennox called that intuition. There was a night in 2011. February. Opal's mother was in hospice at DCH Regional. Pancreatic cancer? The doctor said it could be hours or days. Opal had been at the hospital for 3 straight nights. I told her I'd come at 7 when my shift ended. At 3:47 a.m., the feed water flow rate dropped 6% in under a minute. No alarm. It was within the system's tolerance band. But I felt the floor plates cool on the north side. Uneven. Wrong. I pulled the spray guns back manually and called the day crew in early to run a tube inspection. They found a hairline crack in a generating tube on bank 3. If that tube had failed during full load operation, superheated water would have contacted the smelt bed. I got to the hospital at 9:15 a.m. Opal's mother had died at 6:40. Opal was sitting in the hallway holding a styrofoam cup of coffee that had gone cold. She looked up at me and didn't say anything. She didn't have to. I was 2 hours and 35 minutes late to the death of her mother, and I'd spent those hours saving men who'd never know what I chose. I sat down next to her and took the cup out of her hand. She never brought it up again. Not once in 13 years. That's not forgiveness. That's something harder than forgiveness. That's a woman who understands what you do and carries the cost of it without asking you to calculate it for her. Some nights after Opal was asleep, I'd sit in my truck in the driveway. Engine off, windows up, just sitting in the dark with my hands on the steering wheel, not going anywhere, not coming from anywhere. Just sitting in the space between the man the mill needed and the man my wife married, trying to figure out if they were still the same person. I never did figure it out. Opal had my lunch packed the morning Chase fired me. Turkey on white, thermos of coffee, 2 oatmeal cookies in a sandwich bag. She'd heard Chase at the company picnic 3 weeks earlier, asking Randall Cooper, the senior shift operator, how many people it really took to run the boiler. Randall told him 1 superintendent and 4 operators per shift. Chase had written it down on his phone. Opal didn't say anything that night. She just started packing my lunch in a paper bag instead of my old metal box. The metal box stayed on the counter. When I asked why, she said, "Paper's easier to carry if you're walking out for the last time." That woman knew before I did. When I got home that Wednesday morning, she was at the kitchen table. The metal lunchbox was sitting between us. She'd already called Herschel Barrett, Herschel was a property attorney in Northport, had handled the lease transfer when my father died. He'd been telling me for years to read the covenant language carefully to understand exactly what it gave me. Opal didn't ask if I was okay. She said, "Herschel can see you at 2. I went at 2. Herschel's office was above a barbershop on Main Avenue. Drop ceiling, metal filing cabinets, a window unit that had been running since the Clinton administration. He had the lease spread across his desk when I sat down. He'd flagged Section 4, Paragraph 2 with a yellow tab. Any material change in safety operations on the leased parcel requires written approval from the Ives family leaseholder, he read, including but not limited to changes in supervisory personnel responsible for pressure vessel operations, modifications to maintenance schedules for critical safety equipment, and alterations to emergency response protocols. He set his glasses on the desk. Grantham, they fired the supervisory personnel responsible for pressure vessel operations. They didn't ask your approval. They didn't notify you as leaseholder. They're in breach the moment they replaced you without your written consent. He leaned back. But that's not what's going to matter. What's going to matter is what happens to that boiler without you standing next to it. Now this is the part I need to tell you carefully. It's because what Chase Lennox did next wasn't just arrogant. It was the kind of arrogance that gets people killed. 3 days after he fired me, Chase signed a maintenance deferral order. Randall Cooper, the senior shift operator, 26 years at the mill, had submitted a request to pull the boiler offline for a scheduled tube inspection. It was on the maintenance calendar. I'd scheduled it myself before I left. Every 18 months, like clockwork, Chase denied it, signed the deferral himself, wrote in the comments field, "Production targets take priority. Reschedule for Q1. Randall told me later he walked into Chase's office and said, "Mr. Lennox, that inspection isn't optional. Grantham never missed one." Chase looked up from his laptop. "Grantham isn't here anymore. And we're not shutting down a revenue-generating asset for a routine check that the monitoring system can handle remotely." Randall stood there for a long moment. Then he walked out. That was deferral number 1. Over the next 44 days, Chase signed 18 more. 18 deferrals in 44 days. Randall Cooper sent me a text after the 3rd one. No commentary. Just a photo of the maintenance log screen showing Chase's electronic signature next to the word deferred. I looked at it for about 10 seconds, then set my phone on the kitchen counter and went back to recaulking the bathroom window. Opal glanced over from the hallway. She didn't ask what the text said. She could read it on my face, or maybe she could read it in the fact that I didn't pick the phone up again for 3 hours. The 4th deferral was the soot blower rotation. Recovery boilers build up chemical deposits on the generating tubes. Sodium sulfate, potassium carbonate, calcium compounds that harden like concrete if you let them sit. The soot blowers clear the deposits with jets of high-pressure steam. The rotation schedule, which tubes get blown, in what order, at what intervals, isn't something you punch into a computer. It depends on fuel composition, load demand, ambient temperature, and the age of the tube banks. I adjusted that rotation weekly, sometimes daily. I'd maintained a handwritten log for 22 years. The log was in my desk drawer when I left. Nobody asked about it. The 7th deferral was the smelt spout cleaning. Molten smelt flows out of the furnace through 4 spouts into the dissolving tank below. If the spouts clog, the smelt backs up into the furnace. Pressure builds. I'd cleaned those spouts on a rotating 4-day cycle since 1998. Chase's monitoring suite had no protocol for spout cleaning because the Honeywell DCS doesn't measure smelt flow viscosity. That measurement lived in my fingertips. The resistance when you tap the spout housing with a 1/2-inch rod tells you how much buildup is inside. Sounds primitive. Kept men alive for 35 years. The 12th deferral was the combustion air damper calibration. That's the one that would matter most. The combustion air balance, primary, secondary, tertiary, determines how the black liquor burns inside the furnace. Too much primary air and the char bed overheats. Too little tertiary air and you get incomplete combustion. carbon monoxide spikes, and unburned liquor accumulating on the tube surfaces. The DCS monitors oxygen levels in the flue gas. What it doesn't monitor is the acoustic signature of the flame pattern, that low-frequency hum Dutch Morrison taught me to hear. When the dampers drift out of calibration, the hum changes pitch. Drops maybe 2 hertz. You wouldn't notice unless you'd been listening for decades. Nobody was listening. The replacement they hired was a man named Kevin Prewitt. 41 years old, 11 years of boiler experience, all of it on package boilers at a natural gas cogeneration facility outside of Huntsville. Package boilers are to recovery boilers what a campfire is to a blast furnace. Kevin was a competent operator. He was also operating an instrument he'd never touched before, processing a fuel he'd never handled, reading data from a system whose blind spots he didn't know existed. I don't blame Kevin. I blame the man who put him there. During those 47 days, I did something I hadn't done in 35 years. I slept past 5 a.m. I sat on the front porch and watched the sun come up over the pin oaks without checking my watch. I drove to Northport Hardware and bought a new mailbox post because the old one had been leaning since 2019. I installed it on a Tuesday afternoon. Took my time. Level, plumb, cemented in properly. Opal brought me a glass of sweet tea and stood in the yard watching me work. "You're using a level," she said. "Mailbox post should be level." "You haven't used a level on anything at this house in 20 years. She was right. Every home repair I'd done for 2 decades was rushed. Half measured, done between shifts. I finished in the dark with a headlamp. The mailbox post was the first thing I'd built at my own home that I could stand back and look at without thinking about what I needed to get back to. My phone buzzed 14 times that first week. Chase's office, then Randall's personal number, then a number I didn't recognize from the Mills engineering department. I let them all ring. I read the names on the screen and set it face down on the porch railing. Week 2, the calls slowed. Week 3, they stopped. Week 4, Randall sent another text. This one had words. "Soot blowers running blind. Nobody knows your rotation. Tube temps climbing on bank 2. Kevin's doing his best. He's scared, Grantham." I read it, sitting in my truck in the parking lot of the Winn-Dixie. Opal was inside buying groceries. I sat there with the engine running and the AC on and read it twice. Then I typed, "Tell him to check the east side secondary air damper. It drifts 12 degrees every 60 days, counterclockwise." Then I deleted the message without sending it. It wasn't my boiler anymore. Chase Lennox had made that clear. And what Herschel Barrett had shown me in the lease made it equally clear that the ground under the boiler was still mine, and that Chase had breached the covenant the day he fired me without my approval. I could have filed an injunction. Herschel had the paperwork drafted. I told him to wait. "Wait for what?" Herschel asked. "For the thing that's going to happen." He looked at me over his glasses. "You know what's going to happen? I've known that boiler for 35 years. It's like a man with high blood pressure who stopped taking his medication. He feels fine for a while, then he doesn't. Now this is the part I've been waiting to tell you, because everything up to now was prologue. What happened on October 28th was the sentence. Day 47, 4:12 a.m. Kevin Prewitt was alone in the control room. The DCS showed all parameters within normal range. Feed water flow steady. Furnace temperature reading 1,460 degrees. Oxygen levels nominal. The system showed green across every screen. What the system didn't show was the combustion air dampers running 14 degrees out of calibration. It didn't show the unburned liquor that had been accumulating on the lower tube banks for 3 weeks because the soot blower rotation was wrong. It didn't show the smelt bed migrating to the east side of the furnace because nobody was standing on the floor plates feeling the temperature shift through their boots. At 4:12 a.m., a generating tube on bank 3, the same bank where I'd found the hairline crack in 2011, failed under thermal stress. Superheated water contacted the molten smelt bed. A smelt water explosion in a recovery boiler is not like other industrial accidents. It's not a fire. It's not a leak. It's a detonation. The water flashes to steam instantaneously, 1,600 times its liquid volume, inside a confined space filled with molten chemicals at 1,400 degrees. The pressure wave shattered the boiler casing on the east side, blew out 3 wall panels, sent shrapnel across the recovery area. The concussion broke windows in the admin building 200 yards away. So Kevin Prewitt was in the control room, not on the floor. That saved his life. 2 maintenance workers on the evaporator line suffered concussion injuries from the blast wave. One fractured his collarbone. By the grace of something I can't name, nobody died. But the boiler was destroyed. Southern Loblolly's recovery boiler, the heart of a mill that produced 38% of the company's total revenue, sat ruptured and silent on 40 acres of riverfront land that belonged to me. The OSHA investigation began within 72 hours. Process safety management audit. Federal inspectors. Document subpoenas. Every maintenance record, every deferral order, every digital log from the DCS system. 19 deferred maintenance items, each one bearing Chase Lennox's electronic signature. The EPA arrived the same week. The explosion had released unburned black liquor particulate into the atmosphere. Air quality monitors in Tuscaloosa County showed sulfur compound levels at 3 times the permitted threshold for 6 consecutive hours after the blast. Concurrent violations, separate fines, separate investigation. The mill went offline, not for days, not for weeks. The structural damage to the boiler casing, the tube bank destruction, the foundation cracking from the blast force, the engineering assessment came back at 11 months minimum for rebuild and recertification. 11 months of zero production from a facility that generated $874 million in annual revenue. 3 days after the explosion, I got a phone call, not from Chase, not from Patricia Lennox, from a man named Donald Fulmer, the lead OSHA process safety management investigator assigned to the case. He introduced himself. He was polite. He said he'd reviewed my personnel file, my safety record, and the Hartford steam boiler assessment that mentioned me by name. Then he asked if I'd be willing to serve as a technical expert consultant on the investigation. $1,800 an hour. I said I'd need to talk to my attorney first. Herschel Barrett reviewed the engagement terms in his office the next afternoon. No conflict of interest. I was no longer employed by Southern Loblolly, and the consultation was with a federal agency, not a party to any civil action. Herschel signed off. I reported to the mill site the following Monday. First time I'd been through those gates since September 11th. I badged in with a temporary contractor credential. The security guard, a man named Willis Hodge, who'd worked the gate for 19 years, looked at my badge and then looked at me. "Welcome back, Mr. Ives." He said it the way a man says something he's been holding on to for a while, like he meant it in more ways than one. I spent the next 3 weeks walking the blast site with Fulmer's team. I documented everything, every deferred maintenance item, every calibration that had drifted, every soot blower cycle that had been skipped, every smelt spout that hadn't been cleaned. I wrote it all down in the same kind of composition notebook I'd used for 22 years of handwritten logs, 47 pages. On page 31, I described the combustion air damper calibration that Chase had deferred on October 3rd, deferral number 12. I explained that the east side secondary air damper drifts 12 degrees counterclockwise every 60 days due to a worn actuator mount, a condition I'd compensated for manually since 2014. Without manual recalibration, the tertiary air balance degrades. Incomplete combustion accelerates. Unburned liquor deposits accumulate on the tube banks. Thermal stress on the generating tubes increases by an estimated 15 to 20%. The tube that failed on October 28th was in the exact location where those deposits would have been heaviest. Fulmer read page 31 in the temporary office trailer they'd set up near the recovery area. He read it twice. He set it down. He looked out the trailer window at the ruptured boiler casing, still blackened from the blast. "Mr. Ives," he said, "how long would it have taken to recalibrate that damper?" 45 minutes. He was quiet for a long time. "And the deferral was signed by Chase Lennox? October 3rd. Same signature on all 19. Fulmer picked up page 31 again. He didn't read it this time. He just held it like a man holding something that had weight beyond the paper. The full report went to OSHA's regional administrator on November 14th. 47 pages. Every deferral documented. Every consequence traced to its origin. Every signature identified. I'd written technical reports before, tube inspection summaries, annual safety assessments, incident analyses for the insurance underwriters. This was different. This was an autopsy of a system that had been kept alive by one man's hands and then killed by another man's pen. Fulmer's team submitted their own findings the same week. The two reports aligned on every material point. The proximate cause of the smelt water explosion was thermal stress failure of a generating tube on Bank 3 caused by accumulated unburned liquor deposits resulting from deferred soot blower maintenance, compounded by combustion air damper miscalibration that went uncorrected for 44 days. The root cause was a pattern of systematic maintenance deferrals authorized by a single individual with no recovery boiler operating experience, no process safety management certification, and no consultation with qualified supervisory personnel. That individual was named 14 times in the federal report. The OSHA citation landed on December 9th. Willful violations under 29 CFR 1910.119. Its process safety management failures across 6 categories. Proposed penalties, $2.1 million. The willful classification meant OSHA had determined the violations weren't negligent. They were deliberate. Someone had been told the maintenance was necessary and had chosen to defer it anyway. Randall Cooper's documented request, the one Chase had denied on day 3, was Exhibit A. The EPA consent order came 2 weeks later. Air quality violations from the October 28th release. Sulfur compound exceedances. Failure to maintain emissions controls on a Title V permitted source. Fines, $1.4 million. Mandatory environmental remediation assessment for the river-adjacent soil contamination from the blast debris. Southern Loblolly's stock had opened at $41.20 on the morning of my firing. By Thanksgiving, it was $29.08. By Christmas, it was $25.12. A 39% decline. The mill, 38% of company revenue, was a hole in the ground producing nothing. The rebuild estimate had climbed from 11 months to 14 after the foundation engineers found deeper cracking than the initial assessment caught. 2 institutional investors, Whitfield Capital Partners and Morrison Taylor Funds, filed derivative suits against Southern Loblolly's board of directors in January. The suits alleged breach of fiduciary duty, failure of oversight, and waste of corporate assets. The specific waste identified, the $4.2 million modernization package that Chase had pitched as a replacement for human expertise, the $874 million in annualized revenue lost during the shutdown, and the $3.5 million in combined federal penalties. The suits named Patricia Lennox individually. The board met on January 22nd. Herschel Barrett had filed our breach of covenant notice under Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the lease 3 days earlier. The notice was straightforward. The leaseholder had not been consulted regarding the material change in safety operations, specifically the termination of the supervisory personnel responsible for pressure vessel operations. The lease was in breach. Remediation required restoration of compliance safety oversight subject to the leaseholder's written approval, or the lease would be subject to termination proceedings. Termination of the lease would mean Southern Loblolly no longer had legal right to operate on the 40 acres where the recovery boiler, the chemical storage tanks, and the wastewater treatment lagoons sat. Without that ground, the mill couldn't function. Period. I know what happened in that board meeting because Patricia Lennox's general counsel, a man named Stuart Whitmore, called Herschel Barrett the next morning. Herschel put me on speaker. Whitmore's voice was careful, measured. The voice of a man choosing every word like he was walking across a frozen pond. Mr. Barrett, the board has accepted Chase Lennox's resignation, effective immediately. Mrs. Lennox has asked me to communicate her interest in discussing the lease covenant compliance directly with Mr. Ives. Herschel looked at me. I was sitting in the same chair I'd sat in back in September, the one with the cracked leather armrest. The window unit was humming. I could hear the barber downstairs sweeping. "Stuart," Herschel said, "my client is available, but I want to be clear. The covenant requires Ives family approval for safety operations on that parcel. That approval was never requested. The breach is not prospective. It's already occurred." Silence on the line. "We understand," Whitmore said. 2 days later, Patricia Lennox drove to my house. I saw her car from the kitchen window. Silver Lexus. She parked behind Opal's Camry in the driveway and sat in the car for a full minute before getting out. I watched her check her reflection in the rearview mirror. Adjust her collar. She was 62 years old. She'd run Southern Loblolly for 9 years. She'd inherited it from her father, Benton Lennox, who'd built it from a single-line mill in 1971. Benton and my grandfather had shaken hands on the original lease, 2 men who understood that paper mills and the ground they sit on aren't the same thing. Patricia knocked. Opal answered. I heard Opal say, "He's in the kitchen," the way you'd say it about a man who wasn't going anywhere. Patricia walked in. She was holding a folder. She set it on the table but didn't open it. She looked at me. Then she looked at the kitchen, the thermos on the counter, the lunchbox on the shelf, the composition notebook stacked by the phone. "Grantham," she said, "I owe you an apology." I didn't respond, not because I was being dramatic, because an apology from the woman who'd put her nephew in charge of a bomb and then let him dismantle every safeguard I'd built wasn't something I needed to react to. It was something I needed her to finish. Chase was my sister's son. I thought the role would give him structure. I was wrong. I was wrong about what he could handle. And I was wrong about what your position meant to this operation. I should have known. My father would have known. She opened the folder. "The board has authorized me to offer you full reinstatement as recovery boiler superintendent at a salary of $188,000, a $50,000 signing consideration, and a formal seat on the mill's Process Safety Management Committee with veto authority over maintenance scheduling." She slid the folder across the table. I looked at it. I looked at the numbers. They were generous. More than generous. They were the numbers of a company that had done the math and understood that the alternative was losing the ground under their feet. I closed the folder and slid it back. "I appreciate you coming out here, Patricia, but I'm not coming back." Her face didn't change, but her hands did. She pressed her palms flat on the table like she needed to feel something solid. "Grantham, you didn't ask." She stopped. 35 years. I ran that boiler through every upgrade, every overhaul, every audit. Your father trusted me with it because my grandfather trusted him with the land. That's not a job. That's a covenant. And your nephew treated it like a line item. I leaned back. "You want the lease in compliance? I'll approve your next superintendent. I'll review their credentials. I'll sign off on the safety plan. That's what the covenant requires, and that's what my grandfather intended. But I'm not walking back onto that floor as an employee of the person who let a 30-year-old with a packaging startup on his resume override Randall Cooper's professional judgment and sign 19 deferral orders on equipment he couldn't identify in a photograph." Patricia Lennox sat very still. Her eyes moved to the window over the sink, the pin oaks in the side yard, the mailbox post I'd cemented in plum in October. "Your grandfather," she said, her eyes still on the window, "was the most stubborn man my father ever met." "I know." She picked up her folder. She stood. She walked to the door. Opal was standing in the hallway. Patricia nodded to her. Opal nodded back. No words. 2 women who understood that the conversation was over. At the door, Patricia turned. "He's gone, Grantham. Chase. He's not at the company." He's not in Tuscaloosa. He went back to Charlotte." "I heard." She left. I turned down 3 full-time offers in the months that followed. 2 from pulp and paper operations in Georgia and Mississippi. 1 from a boiler manufacturer in Ohio who wanted me to run their field services division. I said no to all of them. Not because the money wasn't good, because I'd spent 35 years being indispensable to someone else's operation, and I was done answering a phone at 3 a.m. for a company that could fire me before breakfast. I opened a consulting practice, recovery boiler safety assessments. I worked from the back room of my house, the one Opal had used as a sewing room. She cleared out her fabric bins without me asking. Put a desk in there she'd found at the Habitat Restore for $40. I set up my composition notebooks, my reference manuals, and the brass thermometer Dutch Morrison had given me when he retired. It still worked. First-year billings, $2.9 million. 18 clients across 11 states. Mills that had heard what happened at Southern Loblolly and decided they'd rather pay an expert than explain to OSHA why they hadn't. Chase Lennox's name surfaced once more in a trade publication. He'd taken a position at a consulting firm in Charlotte, management side, not operations. The article described him as a former executive at a major pulp and paper manufacturer. It did not mention the explosion. It did not mention the 19 signatures. It did not mention the 2 men with concussion injuries or the man whose collarbone he broke from 200 yards away by signing a piece of paper. Southern Loblolly's mill came back online in September of the following year. 14 months dark. The rebuild cost $67 million. The derivative suits settled for $23 million. Patricia Lennox stepped down as CEO in March, replaced by an outside hire from Weyerhaeuser. The new superintendent, a man named Dale Fowler, 28 years of recovery boiler experience out of International Falls, Minnesota, called me before his first day. I reviewed his credentials. I approved his appointment under the covenant. We talked for 90 minutes about damper calibration. I signed the approval letter at my kitchen table. Opal notarized it. She'd gotten her notary commission in 2004 to help with my father's estate and had kept it current every year since. She stamped the form, looked at me, and said, "That's the first piece of paper from that mill I've been happy to see you sign." Saturday mornings now, Opal and I sit at the kitchen table. She makes coffee in the percolator her mother gave her, the same one that was sitting on the counter the morning I drove to the hospital 2 hours and 35 minutes too late. The coffee's hot. It's in a real cup, not a thermos, not a travel mug balanced on a control panel, a cup on a saucer at a table with my wife. We don't rush. There's nowhere I need to be at 6 a.m. No shift change, no feed water alarm, no floor plates to check. The phone sits on the counter and it stays quiet on Saturday mornings because I don't take calls before noon on weekends. Not anymore. Last Saturday, Opal set her cup down and looked at me across the table. "You're sitting different," she said. "How so?" "Like the chair's yours." She was right. For 35 years, every chair I sat in belonged to someone else's schedule. The control room chair, the conference room chair, the truck seat between the mill and the hospital. I was always sitting somewhere temporarily, waiting for the next alarm, the next shift, the next crisis that needed my hands. This chair is mine. This table is mine. This morning is mine. A recovery boiler doesn't forgive. You can't sweet-talk it. You can't overrule it with a spreadsheet or a monitoring suite or a signature from a man who's never felt the floor plates shift under his boots. It runs on physics and chemistry and 35 years of someone paying attention. Take that away, and it'll tell you exactly what it thinks. Just once, and loud enough that the windows break 200 yards out. That's my story. And I think some of you know what it's like to be the one who kept something dangerous from becoming a disaster every single day without anyone noticing until you stopped. If that's you, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. And if this one stayed with you, subscribe and hit the bell. There are more where this came from.